Graham-Leigh. I'm going to be chairing this first session. Yeah, there is. Is that any better? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So we'll try and speak up so everyone can hear us. So before we start, I just need to let people know, as you can see, we do have some people filming today. So if anyone has a problem with appearing in the film, just let me know and we'll make sure that you don't. So just tell me. Okay, so we're here today talking about alternatives to austerity on the eve of an election when we're being told by the government that actually austerity has worked. The economic crisis is over, we're all nice and rich again, everything's fine. So, a rhetorical question to you. Do you feel that the economic crisis is over? Exactly. Because, hold on. There's plenty of time to talk later. Because what's happened is the crisis is over for the 1%, and for everyone else things are just as bad as they were in 2008. And we're seeing that actually poor people, ordinary people, are being cleansed out of London. So we have campaigns locally around the West Hendon estate, around Sweets Way, that we'll be hearing about in one of the workshops later, where people are being driven out of their homes, and their homes are being demolished to build yuppie flats instead, for people who can afford, hundreds of thousands of pounds. And really no one is talking about this, so that's why we need events like this. And obviously, as we'll hear throughout the day from many campaigners who are fighting the cuts, fighting the estate closures and so on. But what we also need is an organisation that brings all those struggles together, that puts political pressure not just on the local councils that are cutting services, but on the central government, which is where all this stuff comes from. So that's what People's Assembly is for. If you're not on our mailing list, please do join our mailing list, come along, support other events, help us build this campaign. So just one other announcement. Obviously we're hearing today what our speakers would put in their People's Manifesto, but we've also got an opportunity for you to tell us what you would put in your People's Manifesto. So we've got some forms here at the front, so in one of the breaks you can come and write down what you want and we will project it on the wall. So, without further ado, we've got three fantastic speakers. We've got Owen Jones, we've got Max Hyde from the NUT, and we've got Nick McCarthy from the PCS and People's Assembly. So I know we've got a number of questions that people have submitted in advance, so I'm going to be calling various people to read their question out. But we're just going to start with a general question. So what would your key points be in your People's Manifesto? So I think we'll start with...
Well, great to see you all. It's a year since Tony Benn died to the very day, and it's worth remembering that. And on his gravestone, it's inscribed, he encouraged us. And that's what he wanted his legacy to be. And he continues to encourage me, and I know he encourages so many other people in this room today, and his fight goes on. And he always reminded us that the way we get change is the burning flame of anger at injustice and the burning flame of hope at a better world. And that's what this is about today. Anger at injustice, but hope at a better world. And that's Tony Benn's legacy. Now, in terms of the People's Manifesto, this is what I do quickly. Instead of millions of people being in work in poverty, getting up in the morning, earning their poverty day after day, we have to abolish in-work poverty once and for all. No poverty minimum wage, a living wage for everyone in work, no ifs, no buts. That instead of millions of people trapped on social housing waiting lists, of 1 in 4 young Londoners growing up in overcrowded homes, their health, their education, their well-being, all of them damaged as a consequence, instead of millions being trapped with private landlords charging rip-off rents, dependent on housing benefit, lining the pockets of rip-off extortionate landlords, we've got to control private rents and give councils the power to build a new generation of council housing. Council housing that fulfills the dream of Nye Bevan, who said it should recreate the loveliest features of the English and Welsh village, where the butcher and the doctor live next door to one another. And instead of that, overcrowding, instead of rip-off rents, council housing, better quality than private rented housing, which is what it was built to be. That instead of millions trapped in unemployment or 0 hours or bogus self-employment, self-unemployment, you could call it. Instead, we learn from countries like Germany, have an industrial strategy, create the renewable energy jobs of the future, take on the environmental and the jobs crisis as well. Instead of banks bailed out by the people, where we nationalise the debt and privatise the profit, where they carry on paying more bonuses than every other EU country put together, where they don't lend to small businesses. We, the people who bailed those banks out, should have democratic control of those banks, public investment banks, to rebuild our shattered economy. That instead of kicking people at the bottom of society, we start saying the people at the top start paying their taxes, like Google, like Amazon, like Sir Philip Green, £25 billion of money because they refuse to pay their taxes. The accountancy firms helping to draw up tax laws, then telling their clients how to avoid the very laws they themselves have written in the first place. However rich you are, no ifs, no buts, you have to pay every penny of your taxes, and proper progressive taxes on income and wealth, where instead of privateers profiteers running our rail and our energy supply, with the railways which is fragmented and inefficient, where it's cheaper to travel halfway across the world by plane than to travel by train in your own country, where we subsidise these rip-off rail companies. As each franchise expires, we bring them back under the control of the people of this country. And not just rail, energy as well, water, utilities should belong to us and meet the needs of the people, not rip off profiteers or the German or French governments for that matter either. Where we have proper rights for workers, trade unions can represent the real wealth creators of this country, working people, and give them a slice of the wealth they create. I think these are some basic common sense policies that, instead of kicking people at the bottom, instead of enriching a tiny elite at the expense of the people of this nation, we start building a society not rigged in favour of the mean and the greedy, but a society run in the interest of working people. They're only a start, but it's common sense and it's about hope. So let's start building for that hope.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along today. I'd just like to start with 2 points. One to remember and one to forget. We should remember that what this government has been doing is trying to create a smaller state, and in doing so trying to benefit the wealthy and take money away from the poor. And something to forget, we should forget about the deficit when we're putting together our People's Manifesto. And I say that advisedly. I say that on the basis that economists across a particular part of the economy would always argue that. And I've got a quote from you to back that up. Since the 1930s, both theory and practice have shown that deficits often play an essential and positive role, and that fixation on eliminating deficits by contractory fiscal measures is counterproductive. History shows that it is mainly by increasing investment and productive and decently remunerated work that we achieve more balanced budgets. And that's a quote from 21 British and European economists who represent a real body of economic thought. So when I say we should forget the deficit, and we shouldn't have it as part of our manifesto, it shouldn't be an alternative to the cuts. It should be a positive manifesto for social justice. So, what should be in the People's Manifesto? Well, 3 things I'm going to talk about, but then I'm going to focus on one in particular. Firstly, our manifesto should redistribute wealth, increasing wages, and through increasing wages, secure employment and union negotiating power. Secondly, it should redistribute wealth by fair taxes and a welfare system, and better public services, housing, etc. And thirdly, it should redistribute power through democracy. But I'm going to focus on wages, and I'm from a trade union, so I'm going to focus on trade union power, because they're critical things for us to look at here. Firstly, if you look at the experience of the United States had 30 years in which wages have stagnated. And that is something we should look at in Britain and see what the future could be like. And the reason that wages have stagnated in the US is because trade unions have reduced dramatically in size, and bargaining coverage has reduced dramatically in size. Huge increase in inequality in the United States as well. So average wages are about the same level as they were 30 years ago. So what has happened in Britain? In Britain, up until the crash, wages tended to increase by a couple of % above the retail price index, above inflation. But since the crash, they've fallen well below that, and the average wage has reduced in real terms by 8.4% over that period. So people dramatically worse off. That's £64 billion taken out of the pockets of workers, and which you can't spend at all. And that has an enormous effect on the economy as well. Now, why has that been? Well, is that because there's no money around? Certainly not. As Owen said, bankers' bonuses never greater. £64 billion of bankers' bonuses. And it's roughly the same amount on that period has come through. FTSE 100 directors, 146% pay increase during that period. And FTSE 100 companies, only 100 companies, FTSE 100 companies are hoarding £53 billion worth of cash rather than pay workers. So, you know, the money is definitely there. It's just a question of how we get it. So, what are the key levers on pay? Well, there's a minimum wage. What can the government do? Increase the minimum wage. They pay public sector workers, and we can look at how that is done. And they also dictate industrial relations policy. So that is, you know, how collective bargaining can take place in the economy. And what do the major parties say about wages at the moment? Well, Labour has said something about the minimum wage. They would increase it to £8 an hour over the period of the government, over 5 years. David Cameron recently said that Britain should have a pay rise, but I don't think that anybody in the audience of the British Chamber of Commerce he was talking to believed it, and I don't think he believed it either. And I think today Vince Cable has come out with a very profound statement about pay as well, that we should produce regional data by sectors, which would give people something to lobby for. So I don't think any of those are going to give us a solution. What we really need is we need a restoration of collective bargaining across the economy and trade union rights, so that workers have more power in the workplace. And that's the real critical thing about how we manage to do this. My union, PCS, is currently facing a union-busting attempt from the Tories to undermine the entire union, to take away facility time for our union reps, sack reps where they're causing problems, and undermine our finances by withdrawing our subscriptions, deductions from salary. So that's the type of thing they're doing. They're trying to weaken unions where they respond to them at the moment. And what we need is a positive agenda for unions in the future. So what my manifesto is that Britain should have a pay rise, but that's an easy thing to say. What we really need are trade union rights at work, and we need things to underpin it. So we should have a real living wage. TUC claim is for £10 an hour. We should get rid of end the public sector pay freeze and ensure that public sector workers get a decent rise. That's 20% of the entire workforce, has a massive effect on it. And most importantly, an increase in the power for unions to negotiate on behalf of their members. This will both stimulate the economy, so it gets rid of the deficit and all that sort of thing, and reduces inequality and poverty and puts money back into people's pockets, and who wouldn't vote for that?
It's going to be a very long agenda, isn't it? But quite rightly so too. So all of the above, but I want to concentrate on public services. And the thing that I would put in the manifesto, and we've got a brilliant NUT manifesto. If you manage to avoid having one, we can send you one, and it's online as well. But I want to concentrate on the services bit of it. In my manifesto, definitely say, stop trying to turn public services into businesses. That's a really important thing. We have seen what the imposition of a business model has done to health, has done to the police, and is doing to education. We know that in hospitals that got into trouble and weren't serving the public, like the situation at the North Staffs Hospital, it was because they'd been given targets against which they were measured. So the targets became the important thing, not serving the local population. And when people objected about it, they were silenced out of working in that hospital. We had shocking revelations yesterday that one of the big contributory factors to child exploitation in Rochdale was that the police were in that area were concentrating on targets imposed on them by central government that didn't involve looking after vulnerable children in their society. So these things drive us away from serving the public. And in education, we keep on being told that the business model is the right model. And all I can say is that it is absolutely not the right model. And I'm going to tell you a story about this, which is online. I've got this story courtesy of Professor John Macbeth, and it highlights what is wrong. It's a story from Santa Barbara in the States, which is where a lot of this business model of services comes from. And it was written by a guy called Bill Cerrone, who's the county superintendent of schools in Santa Barbara. And in Santa Barbara, they had a very successful businessman. He ran a wonderful ice cream company. So, of course, he got views on education and how you should actually educate the local population. And what he said are the same things that you hear said here, and indeed across the world. And he said that, you know, schools were designed for the industrial age. They're not in tune with modern needs. And he felt strongly that educators themselves were a major part of the problem. So, teachers to blame. Because we're resisting change, we're protected by tenure, and we are overly bureaucratic. And if only schools looked to a business model, they could improve dramatically with zero defects, total quality management, and continuous improvement. Now, being a brave or a foolhardy man, he said this in a big public meeting. And of course, in the meeting, because they are members of the public, were teachers. And one teacher put up her hand. And she said, "I love your ice cream, brilliant. Couldn't eat enough of it, particularly the blueberry ice cream, which he was very well known for." And so she started talking to him. Of course, she's very good as a teacher, and she drew him into the conversation very well. And she asked a question. She said, when you're on the receiving dock, and you're talking about the importance of your ingredients, the things that go into your business, what happens if you get a shipment of blueberries that aren't quite good enough? And he replied truthfully that he would send them back. And she said, and this is what she said, teachers can never send back blueberries. We take them, big, small, rich, poor, gifted, exceptional, abused, frightened, confident, homeless, rude and brilliant. We take them with attention deficit hyperactive disorder. We take them with junior rheumatoid arthritis and English as a second language. We take them all, every one. And that is why it's not a business, it's a school.
This government has mounted an unprecedented attack on the welfare state, covering health, housing, social security and legal aid. What could a People's Manifesto do to rebuild a welfare state fit for the 21st century?
Okay, did everybody hear that? Okay, so I think I'm going to bring in Max first.
Okay, sorry, I'm just writing the question. The most important thing is, A, stop it now, because that doesn't cost any money, does it? Stop it now. The second thing is to actually tell the truth about things. I was at, there's an organisation called Bite the Ballot that's going into schools at the moment to encourage young people to sign up to vote so that they are enfranchised. And one of the, they do really good interactive sessions. And this young woman in a school in Birmingham was with these sixth formers, and she was asking them how much did they think, you know, what did they think about welfare? And the first thing that they said was, there are lots of benefit cheats. It's a big problem. And what she then did was she teased out of them that actually the welfare budget and people who might abuse the welfare budget, it's very small. It's not a big problem. the much bigger problem are people that don't pay their tax. And they're not poor people that don't pay their tax, it's businesses and so on. So it is actually getting the stories out there and talking about what welfare is there for. It's to help people, for example, to have a dignified life. What's wrong with that? When people are properly supported, they can go on and develop and so on. So that's the sort of thing that we need to talk about, that the welfare is there to provide support for some people who need it, sometimes for the longer term, sometimes for the shorter term, and that actually, if then they go into decently paid jobs, that benefits us all, instead of us, at the moment, subsidising employers who aren't paying a living wage. And that's wrong. That's not what we should be doing. We should be helping people. We should be giving them a decent quality of life. So the first thing is to get out there, get those stories out there, because in last year there were cases of people who were obviously physically disabled being attacked in supermarkets and so on because of all the rhetoric in the right-wing press about benefit claimants who were somehow cheating the public. And I never thought in my lifetime that I would see that happening. So it's actually reversing the view on welfare, to see welfare as a public good, not something bad.
Okay, Nick?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of this. There's tax and there's spending. The first bit is tax. PCS has done a lot of work. We represent people who work in tax offices, 50,000 people who work in tax offices around the country, and we've done a lot of work on how you collect tax. There's 120 billion of tax which is lost to the UK economy through avoidance, evasion and non-collection. We did a report about 5 years ago which identified that amount, and then recently did a report which identified huge amounts of evasion which takes place in this country and the work that's needed to try and get that back in. And one of the critical things that's happened during that period is cuts taking place in revenue and customs. And so there's been a 43% cut in the number of people working in revenue and customs over the period of the last 10 years. Started by the last government, continued by this government. Unsurprisingly, the amount of that 120 billion that is being collected is not decreasing at all. 120 billion is a huge amount of money and is enough to pay off our deficit and debt over a period of time. That's 120 billion a year. So therefore, some investment in revenue and customs to bring that money in would be critical, and a change in tax law, which I won't go into in great detail, but our members in HMRC could at great length, to try and ensure that we can take money off the rich, in particular off the likes of Google, Boots, and off rich individuals, so that there is money available. So one side of this is tax, the other side of it is spending. Because you can imagine there would be people in all the major parties who would say, yes, okay, we'll raise tax revenue and we'll use that to pay off deficits. We won't use it for public spending, or we won't use it for the particular targets we'd like to see. So clearly, within our manifesto, we'd have to have clear examples of how you spend what you would raise. Obviously, the NHS, obviously welfare, decent welfare provision for people to maintain that. I mean, the biggest thing that strikes me as being a problem at the moment, though, is housing and the lack of public and social housing in this economy. So my suggestion would be collect tax, use it to sustain our public services, but a massive investment in house building, public and social house building across the economy would be the way forward.
When the banks were bailed out, they weren't bailed out by free market dogma, they were bailed out by the state. Hundreds of billions of pounds of public money. They became Britain's most lavished benefit claimant, but with one key difference from other benefit claimants. So few conditions attached to the support that they got from the state. Paying more bonuses, as I say, than every other European Union country put together. Higher salaries at the top than even their predecessors, not known for their restraint, could even have dreamt of, not lending to small businesses. Huge public support with so few conditions. But compare that to those at the bottom of society. Compare that to those thrown out of work precisely because of the behaviour of those at the top. And benefit sanctioning is one key example of that. For those who don't know what it means your benefits are stopped, suspended, for between 4 weeks and 2 years, when you can claim absolutely nothing in social security regardless of circumstance, on the basis you failed to abide by the strict conditions attached to receiving the pathetic amount of support that you were eligible for from the state. So in the last 18 months, about 1 million people sanctioned. One of the main reasons that so many people, 1 million people last year, were driven to food banks, unable to feed themselves. But I want to give you one concrete example. A 60-year-old man called Stephen Taylor. A 60-year-old man who was an army veteran. And this 60-year-old man was selling poppies for the Royal Legion to raise money for maimed and injured former comrades of his. And he was desperately looking for work. And if you're 60 years old and out of work, it's tough, it's hard. But he was trying, including in a supermarket where he was selling those poppies. He had his benefits sanctioned for 4 weeks on the basis his volunteering for the Royal Legion showed he wasn't trying hard enough to look for work. Compare and contrast. Top of society, plunge this country into economic calamity, and you'll get all the support you want with no conditions attached. Those at the bottom, that support ever more conditional. What that is socialism for the rich, and it's capitalism sink or swim for those at the bottom of society. And that sums up our society, where the welfare of the rich is there, the state will jump in and support them, but for those at the bottom, ever more shredded. If we want to reduce spending on social security, then as I said before, instead of millions earning their poverty, dependent on in-work benefits, subsidising poverty wages on an industrial scale, then have a living wage. It will save billions of pounds every single year. If we don't want to subsidise private landlords to the tune of billions of pounds every single year, then we control rent and give councils the power to build housing again, which will not only reduce the 5 million strong social housing waiting list in this country, it will bring down the housing benefit bill, but also it will create skilled work, skilled jobs, the sorts of jobs that are lacking for young people, particularly trapped on 0-hour contract work. It has a multiplier effect across the entire economy, and that will get people into work. And finally, that industrial strategy. Create those hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs within an active industrial strategy, as in Germany, which will again reduce the amount we are spending on unemployed people who are desperately looking for work. So instead of a welfare state that subsidises the rich, instead of a society rigged in favour of the mean, the greedy, we instead have a welfare state which supports people and doesn't subsidise the many ills of society that afflict all of us today.
Okay, so the next question is from Diesel. Diesel?
Yep, that's me. I'm Diesel. I'm the Green Party elected candidate for Tottenham. My question is, how do we build broad credibility and buy-in for sustainable, non-growth alternatives to our current international free market economy, which is driven by rules set by the banks and global corporations?
Nick. Answer that first.
Right, okay. Not an area of my expertise, it's fair to say. The question really was about how do we develop green alternatives.
It's more that when we try to put... Sorry, if it's okay.
Please.
It's when we try to put the kinds of points that are being made here, and you get the likes of Andrew Neil or others, we're belittling. It's like, oh, we're the ones that are unrealistic. We're talking nonsense, and those grown-ups have the answer. Whereas actually what they're promoting is unsustainable, and it's reckless and unstable. But we need to get across that credibility gap so people outside of this room listen to the good stuff that's being said today. So it's really about how you build those bridges between what's being said here to the bigger public out there.
Right, that's okay. Got it now, I think. Well, I mean, quite genuinely, I think there's a really important point here. And my view is that whenever we talk about the environment, whenever we talk about green policies, we should start with the sentence, let's stick to the science. Because the science is unequivocal. If you look at what the IPCC, the climate change, international climate change body says, they say that there is an increase in global temperature, and a large proportion of that is caused by human activity. This is a body which, you know, it represents everybody who is anybody in these industries, and it's not a politically driven body which is attempting to undermine these. So my clear view on all of this was we should start by saying let's stick to the science, because the science is so credible on this, and then once you've done that and established your credentials on that, then everything flows from that, doesn't it? All of the renewable energies, all of the climate change support and stuff comes entirely from that. So that's my answer to that question. Thank you.
Well, as for growth has to be sustainable, and I think that's the point. I mean, I don't go around arguing for non-growth myself. The issue is the resources that are finite on this planet and how we actually have an economy that's sustainable. Obviously, it's not sustainable at the moment, and we have an existential crisis that faces our entire civilization. So that's a bit of a biggie. We probably need to sort that out at some point. But just the point though about how we get a message across. The thing we've always got to remember is most people outside of politicos don't think in terms of left and right. They think in terms of issues to be addressed in a way that's convincing, that's coherent, that resonates with their experiences, and is told in a language that they understand. Now, sometimes the defenders of the status quo are far better at doing that than those who want to change society. And we end up perhaps learning how to talk to each other quite well, but not necessarily talking to people outside of that bubble. And it's important we do that. And it's important we start where people are. And I'll give you one example of a grouping in the electorate. They want a living wage. They want increases of tax on the rich. They want renationalisation of rail and energy. They want a statutory living wage. They want to abolish zero-hour contracts. I'm talking about UKIP voters, according to the polls. I'm not arguing we're going to win over all UKIP voters, clearly. But there is a section of whoever in society, even UKIP voters, that can be won over if we can appeal to people and resonate with their experiences and speak in a language that they understand. We shouldn't write anybody off within reason, to be fair. We shouldn't write anybody off. We should win over as many people as we can on the bread and butter issues that actually affect our society. And just in terms of who are the real moderates and who are the real extremists. Are the moderates people who leave millions of people in work poverty, earning their poverty day after day? Millions of people trapped in overcrowded homes and overcrowded, and on social housing waiting lists, whilst Russian oligarchs buy up new build properties in London and leave them vacant, where the wealth of the top 1,000 people can double in 5 years, whilst 1 million people are driven to food banks, the sixth richest country on the face of the earth, where the real moderates going around invading countries and leaving them overrun by fundamentalist fanatics. I don't think they're the real moderates. I think the real moderates are people who think if you're in work you should have a living wage you can live on. That instead of leaving millions trapped on social housing waiting lists, we have councils building housing again and getting people into work. That the rich should be paying their taxes. That given they're richer than they've ever been, they can afford to pay a bit more. That public services shouldn't be run by profiteers. They should be run in the interests of the people of these countries. Those are the real moderate demands. And the extremists are those who leave a society where the rich are booming like never before, whilst millions of people in a prosperous, booming nation are struggling to make ends meet. So let's stop calling them the extremists and claim the moderate mantle for ourselves.
One of the ways that you can approach arguments with people is to talk about what happens to our children and grandchildren. It's a common worry among people because we want there to be, well, first of all, we want there to be a decent environment when those children are growing up. Somewhere to live where the air is clean, where you have access to water, all these sorts of things. So that's one of the ways that you can actually begin to talk to people and to educate them. I'm a teacher, of course I believe people can be educated. And that raises a common view and builds a momentum when you talk about these things. I also think that it's really important that our children in schools are given space to discuss these very important issues. At the moment, the curriculum is very driven by ever-narrowing targets to do with literacy and numeracy. And actually, there are all sorts of other things that are very important as well, that would make them better citizens, and also better at educating parents too about the issues. And so what we always argue for is a broad and balanced curriculum within that curriculum, space so that young people can talk about important issues, the environment, sustainability, talk about teamwork, and talk about international issues, all that sort of thing. So my focus is, let's see, what sort of a world do we want for our children? I know lots of people in London who are really worried about what will happen to their children. Will they have somewhere to live, just as being described? And so these are big worries for young people in schools. So I would argue we need space and time so that we can develop critical thinking, good analysis of situations for our young people, because they're the ones who are going to have to work hard to get us out of the mess that we're in at the moment.
Okay, so next question is from Rashida Islam.
Do you agree that the recent attacks by millionaire Nigel Farage on the Muslim community...
Speak up a bit, please.
Okay.
We'll repeat it if needs be.
Yes, thank you. Arguing that they're a fifth column, and following the irregular media and political attacks on migrants in recent years, shows that those at the top will use this crisis to scapegoat those who have not created it, and as well as supporting the Stand Up to Racism demo next week, what else can be done to counter scapegoating and celebrate our diversity?
Did anyone get that, or would you like me to repeat it? Okay, so the question is, do you agree that the recent attacks by millionaire Nigel Farage on Muslim communities, arguing that they are a fifth column, and following the recent media and political attacks on migrants in recent years, shows that those at the top will use this crisis to scapegoat those who have not created it? And as well as supporting the Stand Up to Racism demo next week, what else can be done to counter scapegoating and celebrate our diversity? So I think, Owen first.
A great question, and such an important question. Nigel Farage's comments are completely despicable and an attempt to turn us against each other. Let's have a quick chat about UKIP, that proud anti-establishment party led by that rare breed of British politician, a privately educated ex-city broker, bankrolled by multi-millionaire ex-Tories, whose policies are really original, I feel, calling as they do. You've never heard these policies before, seriously. Privatising public services, the NHS, cutting taxes on the rich, and stripping workers of their hard-won right. Sticking it to the man. And then we've got to expose UKIP for what they are. But Islamophobia and anti-Muslim prejudice, tragically, go far wider, far broader than UKIP. If I think of the young Muslims I grew up with in my sixth form back home, I don't see their lives and their experiences portrayed in the media. And countless media studies have shown that the media overwhelmingly portrays Muslims in a negative light, stigmatising Muslims en masse, sense of collective punishment and collective blame, portrayed as terrorists and extremists, and so on. So it doesn't start with Nigel Farage. It's a far broader problem than that. But the broader issue, and the broader issue from that question, is the fact that people's anger is constantly, cynically, ruthlessly redirected away from those with power, those responsible for the mess we're in, to people's neighbours down the streets instead. And what they tell people is this. People, like low-paid workers, their wages being cut by their bosses, their benefits, in-work benefits cut by this government. Don't be angry with your boss. Don't be angry with the government. Envy instead the unemployed person down the road living in a mansion made out of widescreen television sets. And they say to private sector workers, where pensions have been decimated, one of the great scandals of our time, don't be angry with your boss. Envy instead the nurse or the teacher or the public sector worker next door whose pension is still intact. Why should they have a pension when you don't. And they say to people who can't get an affordable home because governments won't build them, and they can't get a secure job because they've been stripped from our economy by economic vandalism under successive governments, don't be angry with the powerful, envy instead the immigrant getting the job or the home that should rightfully be yours instead. They're telling people this: you've been mugged. But instead of being angry at being mugged, be angry your less deserving neighbour hasn't been mugged quite as much as you have. And it's the politics of divide and rule. Because they know when we're angry with each other, when we are envying each other and fighting over what precious scraps that actually remain in British society for so many people, then we're not going to hold the powerful to account. We might not convince UKIP voters overnight about the merits of immigration, but we can ask them this: who is most responsible for the mess that this country is in? Is it Polish care workers? Is it Nigerian nurses? Is it Indian doctors? Or was it the bankers who plunged this country into economic disaster? The tax dodgers who won't pay their taxes whilst the rest of us have to pay every penny? The poverty-paying bosses who leave millions of people in poverty? Instead of letting them divide each other, divide ourselves, where we're turning on our neighbours, let's make sure we're turning people's anger on the powerful, those who are responsible, instead of the politics of divide and rule. If they succeed, then those at the top will carry on ripping all of us off, and that has to stop.
Absolutely, and it is about asking people simple questions. People are often quite worried about how you challenge something. They're not certain. They know that what people are saying is wrong, but they don't quite know how to challenge it. And sometimes the simple questions are the most powerful. Like, why do you think that, when somebody is in the middle of a tirade about something? And just teasing out why they think that, and in fact, showing them that, or working them towards that, who you should really be angry with. I mean, for example, the most common surname of doctors in the NHS is Khan. So a lot of our doctors are there working for the public good, treating people, looking after them. They're not doing anything wrong. They're actually doing something really positive. And so it's bringing little bits and pieces like that. The reason that public services seem to be so stretched is not because of a huge influx of migrants, but because they've cut the money in the public sector, given to the public sector. And that's the real scandal, not the fact that we have some people who want to make a home and a life in this country. Often personalising things are very important. I don't look like it, but my father was an immigrant. He came after the Second World War from Poland. And the reason he came was because his entire family had disappeared in the Second World War and he had no home to go to. And it's talking about those things on the basic level of interacting with people and raising their consciousness. It's very important that we get the message out in our schools as well. Show Racism the Red Card do some wonderful work in schools, talking to our young people. And they were doing a project with the MUT on trying to save young people from being radicalised, not by Muslim extremists, but actually by the English Defence League. How those young people were suckered into a path that became very difficult to leave because they were fed lies. And what they found were a lot of young people didn't realise there was such a thing as a legal immigrant. They thought that all immigrants to this country were illegal. And so then you think, well, there's a big job of work to be done. And so education is very important. Tackling people, but in a very straightforward way. Why do you think that? And they think it because of the Daily Mail headlines that they have. For example, on the 7th of September, not last year but the year before, I was at a friend's house who reads the Daily Mail. And the front page of the Daily Mail was, influx of migrants causes schools crisis. Now that was a very inflammatory headline because, as you know, there is a schools place crisis, but it's not because of migrants, it's because the government won't allow local authorities to build schools where they're needed and when they're needed. And so it's about getting that story out and being cleverer and using examples like the one that Owen did. Stories are very, very important. So it's about tackling it, telling our stories, and just correcting people, or writing to the paper and say, I believe that that was wrong. Just always, always tweeting the BBC, just always, always building that sort of local idea, personalising it. Dr. Khan is a wonderful person, not somebody who's trying to undermine this country. And finally, British values. What an insult from this government to try and reinstate this idea of British values. The things that they come out with are not British values, they are actually human rights that we think should be applied throughout the world. And when young children come and they're told that they're British values, actually it sounds as though other people don't have these values. But there's one value that I do not agree with, and I certainly don't agree with badging them as British values. But the one particular thing is this idea that you must have respect for the law when perhaps it's a bad law. And so what I said at the Oxford Union was, you know, this is what David Cameron is saying, so we're the suffragettes, not British.
Thank you. Yeah, the question was about Nigel Farage, and yes, Nigel Farage is appalling. However, you also need to look at all of the other major parties and what they say about immigration, and they're all lying, and they're all lying because they want to use stoke prejudice to get votes. What the plain fact is that we need immigration in this country, and we benefit enormously out of immigration. And that's one of the real key things we need to get across when we're talking about immigration. I read a really interesting fact the other day, is that London's population has reached the level it was in the 1980s. Okay, so London's population has fallen by 2 million, and that's 2 million people who've been moving out of London to other parts of the country, and now it's got itself back to about the level it was in the 1980s. And you know, when Nigel Farage talks about immigration, he says, "Oh, number of people the size of a city of Bristol has moved to this country last year." Actually, they've moved to London, and we're quite happy that they've moved to London. So you know, that's really where the huge growth has been in London, building back up the numbers who have left London and stopping London's population being an ageing population. Millions working in our NHS, and that is, I think, the thing that we can show of the huge benefit of immigration into this country. So I think we really need to focus on the positive benefits of immigration, as well as challenging every time it's raised by Nigel Farage and the other parties in the way they talk about it. Thank you.
Well, that's all the questions we have time for, I'm afraid, but we do have the workshop sessions coming up, so there's lots more time for discussion of all of these issues. So just before we thank our speakers, just to let you know, if you haven't decided which workshop you're going to, have a look on your agenda, they're all on there. Rooms 1 and 2 are up on the 3rd floor. There is a lift, but because there's only one lift, if you can manage 3 flights of stairs, please take the stairs, it's good for you, so that the people who can't can actually get in the lift. So I'd just like to thank all of our fantastic speakers and send you off.